Hi, I'm Kavior Moon, and we are at Blum Poe Gallery in La Cienega Boulevard in an exhibition of recent work by the artist Lynda Benglis. Lynda Benglis was one of the founding figures of post-minimalism. She was born in Louisiana, but moved to New York City in the mid-1960s, where she was working in the wake of abstract expressionism, minimalism, and was really experimenting with different kinds of non-traditional materials, working alongside colleagues such as Eva Hesse, Richard Serra. Already in the mid-1960s, shortly after moving to New York, she started to play around with latex and the different sort of movement and gesture of the pour, pouring the latex directly onto the floor and letting it harden in shapes that she couldn't necessarily control. Since then, she's been known for really investigating the physicality of other materials, even more non-traditional materials such as polyurethane foam, and also using chicken wire as an armature for a number of her works. We have one of her largest works to date. It was originally exhibited outdoors, and what we see here in this sculpture is this kind of armature made out of steel with this organic cast material on top. And then floating on top of the stainless steel base is this cast polyurethane coated with this phosphorescent materials. The idea behind that was that at nighttime, the sculpture would appear to, at least the top of the sculpture would appear to glow. Benglis has talked about in this work trying to create a form that was evocative of the landscape, so the title is Hills and Clouds. And she's also talked about it in terms of a form that seems to be at once sort of in this kind of paradoxical way falling as well as rising. One, I think, reoccurring sensation is a feeling of buoyancy. She's talked about learning how to scuba dive and thinking about the ocean in terms of the womb, but then also this kind of lack of orientation and this sensation of kind of lifting and being freed from a certain kind of gravity that you experience while on the ground. And so I think that the way in which these works are installed, there's no particular correct orientation for them, and the kind of lightness that the chicken wire armatures create help to sort of create that buoyant feeling, that sort of lifting sensation. Behind me there are two sculptural reliefs, and these works were made by creating a form out of polyurethane foam sprayed from a can and letting that harden and then casting that piece in stainless steel. And the way in which these enormous forms are kind of suspended onto the wall are very reminiscent of these cantilevered sculptural reliefs that Lynda Benglis exhibited in the 1970s. But these take on a different texture that become much more sort of intricate and much more sort of about the slow accumulation of these almost worm-like figures. Immediately they make me think of sci-fi as opposed to anything art historical. I think this is one of the aspects that hasn't really been talked about in terms of Lynda Benglis's work, which is dual evocations of nature and landscape and the body, but also this element of kitschiness and theatricality, in which you see with her use of phosphorescence as well as her using a very colorful glitter. In a way, these works relate to how her earlier works, sculptural works, are understood in terms of materials become process, become form. But I think that in the present age, there's also another sort of array of references, including the kind of abject quality and the kind of visceral materials of the innards that become environmental. The role that light plays in her work has something to do with the kind of interaction with the surrounding environment, being situated in a specific physical context. And again, this kind of, it speaks to, I think, the oscillation in her work between allusions to the bodily and the figural, as well as the space in which bodies are found, whether it's landscape or this sort of womb-like, visceral, almost primordial environment. In the 1990s, she began to experiment with ceramic, in part because it was sort of overlooked and sort of pushed aside as non-serious or less serious material to use for sculpture. Her ceramic works are interesting because of the way in which they evoke the gesture in terms of their curving forms, as well as these gashes that you see in the corners, as well as the kind of breakdown or takedown of minimalist forms. And so a lot of them you can see evoke this kind of rectilinear structure that is being sort of attacked. The surfaces are splattered with matte as well as glossy glazes, different colors. And again, there's a kind of play with colors, some being more earthy and some being much more sort of brilliant. I think that the play with color comes from her background as a painter. And I also do think that it's another way in which you can think about the notion of expressivity in her work, whether it can be a sort of an ironic gesture, sort of, post-abstract expressionism, or if there's also some kind of sincerity. I think that in terms of a politics behind her work, it would be one that's not as overt as her photographic or even some of her video works in the 1970s, but ones in which she thinks about bodies and materials, right? And also really taking very seriously materials that were either relegated to crafts or didn't easily fit into the vocabulary of fine art. Her sort of consistent engagement with the gesture you can see as a kind of riposte to the gesture as represented by this very masculine form that has been talked about in terms of abstract expressionism. Outside of the gallery, there are 3 small bronze fountains, and they take the names of atomic bomb explosions, these test explosions. And she's talked about those particular fountains in terms of referencing these real explosions, but what you see in her artwork are these passive explosions and this kind of trickle of water over them. And so there's maybe it brings up this idea of sort of the neutralization of the natural elements over the man-made elements, or in this case, the women-made elements.